All right, everyone. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good? Awesome. Well, welcome to today's presentation. We're going to be talking about .NET open source initiatives at AWS. We're super excited to be here. This is the only session where we are talking about .NET open source. So there's a lot going on open source initiatives at AWS, and we're super excited to be here to talk to you guys about it. So my name is Mayur Devekar. I'm a senior manager for product management. I've been with Amazon for 3 years, and my team is focused on .NET initiatives at AWS. And I'm joined by my colleague, Saikat. So Saikat, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Saikat Banerjee. I'm an engineering manager here at AWS. I run a team that focuses on .NET innovations, and we're doing a bunch around .NET open source. I'm very excited to talk to you about that.
So just so we can set some context, how many people in the room here are .NET developers, just by show of hand? All right, pretty much everyone in the room. Awesome. And then how many people are developing .NET apps on AWS? Okay, awesome, good to know. So we have a pretty packed agenda. So what we're going to be talking about today, so this is the brief agenda that let me just go through quickly. So I'll start by talking about a brief history of .NET on AWS, just so we can level set everyone in terms of where we are with .NET. Then we'll talk a little bit about why open source. This is a big initiative, and we want to share a little bit about what's our general thought process around open source investments at AWS. And then Saikat's going to talk about some of the themes around which we are investing. And the themes are obviously engineering themes, so projects that we are actively contributing to, as well as community, right? So community is a big part of our focus. And we're going to be talking about what are some of those community initiatives that we are involved in at AWS. And then Saikat's also going to do a deep dive on some of the projects that we're actively contributing to at AWS, and then we should have some time for a Q&A towards the end. So hold on to your questions. We'll be happy to take them. So many of you may have already seen this slide. So we're often told it's an overused slide, but a couple of fun facts from this slide that you may or may not know. AWS has been hosting Windows and .NET workloads for 14 years. So we were the first cloud provider to bring Windows and .NET workloads to a public cloud. So we have 14 years of experience hosting Windows and .NET workloads on AWS. Right now, .NET is the third most popular platform behind Python and Java for app development at AWS. Our focus, if you look at the innovations that have happened, the focus has been really around helping developers develop their apps more effectively at AWS. So our innovation has been focused on enabling developers to be more productive with their development efforts on AWS. So started back in 2008 with our SDK. And since then, we've added a bunch of things, right? So we have a CDK for .NET that's available, which allows you, it's basically infrastructure as code. And you can deploy using CloudFormation templates, right? We have PowerShell toolkit that you can use for development. And lately, in the last 2 years, we've also spent a lot of time helping customers get from .NET Framework to .NET Core, right? So customers can get away from Windows and SQL Server licenses and use Linux and cloud-native technology. So that's been one of our big focus areas in the last 2 years. So some of the innovation that you'll see in that top right-hand corner has been more focused on modernization of applications on AWS. So right now, we have all major services that are supporting .NET Runtime. We have over 500 instances on which you can run .NET workloads. So, and 40 of them are actually Linux armies, which have .NET and SQL Server pre-configured within those armies. So just a brief intro on some of the compute services that we have available where you can run .NET workloads. So there's two kinds of services, right? So we have services that can run Windows, and then we have services that purely just run Linux. So on the compute instances that run Windows, you can run .NET Framework applications, right? So the options there are EC2. So EC2 is our compute service. You pretty much can run your VMs on it. It's highly scalable and highly secure. So that was one of the very early offerings that we had in our portfolio. Since then, we've also launched Beanstalk. So Beanstalk is a managed service for running web applications. And you can basically run those managed web applications using EC2 instances on Beanstalk. I don't know how many people know about Lightsail. So Lightsail is a service. If you have a relatively straightforward, simple app, it's one of the best services to get started on AWS. So that is also hosting .NET applications. And then containers have been very popular recently, right? So we can support .NET workloads on ECS, which is our container orchestration service, also EKS, which is the Kubernetes service. EKS is, in fact, becoming super popular lately. It basically takes away, because it's a managed service, you don't have to worry about patching, updates. All of that is already managed for you as part of that managed service. And then Fargate is also another service that is basically allowing you to run web applications on containers, both on ECS as well as EKS. AppRunner, I don't know how many of you know, it's a relatively new service that has been launched. So that's also a service that's basically the new version of Beanstalk, right? So when we talk about the parallel for AppRunner, that's really kind of the Beanstalk service that we had before. And then Lambda, obviously, that's our serverless compute offering. That's been out there, very popular with .NET developers as well. So these are basically the options available. AppRunner and Lambda are only supporting Linux workloads, so you can run .NET Core applications. So those two services are popular for developers who are trying to build new applications using .NET Core on AWS. So we have a lot of different tools that we have built over the years to make it simple for developers to develop .NET applications on AWS. So starting on the left-hand side, we have integration with all popular IDEs. So Visual Studio Code, JetBrains Writer, all of these have toolkits available for AWS. So you install the toolkit, and you can basically deploy your apps directly from there into AWS. So we made it super simple with native integration within the IDEs through our toolkits. We also have SDKs and the CDK that I talked about previously. So this has, the CDK is also very popular. So it allows you to basically write infrastructure as code and use CloudFormation templates to deploy to AWS. So as a developer, you don't really need to know the infrastructure, right? Because that's been one of the biggest pain points and complaints from our customers is that, hey, I'm a developer, I don't need to know infrastructure, right? So that's where CDKs come in and really kind of abstract the underlying infrastructure with infrastructure as code. We have a number of command line tools also available. So obviously, very popular is the PowerShell tools. We also have extensions for .NET CLI. And then AWS SAM, which is basically for deploying Lambda applications, is also available for .NET. And then .NET Deployment Tool, relatively new in our portfolio. And what it does, it provides you a prescriptive guidance on what services you can deploy your .NET workloads in. It's also available, a function of that's also available within our toolkit. So if you have Visual Studio, for example, the deployment tool is also available within the IDE itself, the Visual Studio IDE. In terms of CI/CD integrations, we integrate with some of the most popular tools. Azure DevOps is one that's very popular with .NET developers. So we have integration with that. We also have integration with our code star services. So code pipeline, code build, all of that also has dotted integration available. And then finally, we have, as I was mentioning, we have spent a bunch of time lately talking about modernization of .NET Framework apps, right? One of the pain points that customers talk about is the dependency that framework apps have on Windows and SQL. And there's a very high cost associated with Windows licenses and SQL Server licenses. So customers are trying to get away from Windows, right? And the way to do that is to get .NET Core, which allows you to then deploy to Linux. So some of the tools that we have here, so specifically Porting Assistant, it's an assessment tool. It allows you to assess your framework applications. It tells you what are some of those incompatibilities and how you can basically go from framework to .NET Core very easily. So it's an assistive tool. It's available as a standalone, like a Windows application. It's also available as a plugin for Visual Studio if you want to directly do the modernization within Visual Studio. Another service we launched last year was Microservice Extractor. So going from monolithic applications to microservices is another very popular way to modernize your applications. So what that service does is it does basically a scan of your application at the code level, and it tells you what parts of your application you can break up into microservices. So it gives you a very prescriptive guidance. We have built in some AI technology within that tool, which actually tells you in a very prescriptive way where can you start breaking your application up into microservices. So again, making that process very simple. And then App to Container is a service that allows you to take existing virtual machines which may be running .NET applications, and it allows you to put that into containers. So again, it's an assistive tool that takes virtual machines and just puts that into containers. Once you have the containers built out, you can deploy them on our container services like ECS and EKS. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about why open source and why are we spending time investing in open source. So as I was preparing this deck, one quote that came to mind from Bill Joy, who was the co-founder and CTO of Sun Microsystems, which said, the smartest people in every field are never in your own company, right? And I think what he meant there was you can go hire the best and the brightest people to work for you, but there's always going to be people in other companies that are smart. And what open source allows you to do is it allows you to bring all these smart people together and solve some of the very complex problems for our customers, right? So we're very passionate about the open source space and the community aspect of it, and that's why we're spending a bunch of our time in open source. A lot of the customers we talk to are enterprise customers, right? So it's been very interesting to hear from customers about why they are considering open source. So one of the biggest drivers for considering open source is that it allows you to innovate faster. It's the multiplier effect, right? Because you're getting help from the community to move faster on some of these projects that you care about deeply. Developers are very passionate about open source as well. So if you're trying to hire developers and retain talent, if you're actively involved in open source, that becomes a very good way to attract talent within your company. Obviously, open source projects are inherently cheaper, so the cost effectiveness is kind of given, and it also allows you to kind of lower your maintenance costs because you're working with the community, and it's a joint effort across the community with these open source projects. Red Hat runs a survey every year where they talk to customers about some of the drivers for open source. And some of these results that we're sharing are very consistent with what we hear from our customers as well. So 82% of the people that were surveyed basically said that they consider vendors more favorably, or they view them more favorably if that vendor is actively involved in open source. They also view a good majority also views open source software to be as secure or more secure than proprietary software. And then some of the use cases that we hear are also very consistent with the survey. So IT infrastructure modernization, digital transformation, app development, and app modernization are some of the popular use cases for open source software around .NET. So we've been saying we love .NET at AWS, and this is something we've been using also a lot in our social media channels. You'll see that being used a lot on Twitter, LinkedIn. And there are a couple of reasons for this, right? So open source really allows us to bring choice, technology, and community to our customers. .NET has been one of the top open source projects. I don't know if you guys know. It's one of the top 30 projects, most popular projects since 2017 in the open source ecosystem. There are 10 million developers that are working on .NET. And this is a number that keeps growing year over year. So it's a very popular platform for developing enterprise applications. There are over 100,000 open source contributions just in .NET, and there are 3,700 companies actively involved in contributing to open source projects. And as I was mentioning, it's the third most popular platform at AWS. And we have over 300,000 customers running Windows and .NET workloads at AWS at this point in time. So I don't know if you know, we are actually not new to the open source space. We have more than 25 active projects around .NET open source at this point in time. And some of the more popular projects are obviously the SDK, which has over 300 million downloads. All the Lambda tools are also very popular. You can see there are over 10 million downloads. X-Ray.NET Agent, and then Porting Assistant for .NET, which is the tool around modernization, has 2,400 customers, and it's been downloaded more than 25,000 times in the last 1.5 years that's been out in the market. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Saikat. Saikat's going to talk about some of the investment themes and also some of the engineering projects within the community that we're involved in. So Saikat, take it away.
Yep. Thanks, Mayur. So investment themes, like Mayur was mentioning, .NET is not new to AWS. So how we have been thinking about investing in .NET open source is we broke it down into engineering investments because it requires dedicated time and effort from SDEs to go and contribute to some of the open source projects, create new open source projects within AWS, solving customer problems, but also prioritizing what the community is saying. And secondly, we thought that we would want to invest in the .NET open source community at large. Like, how do we help the community to create a more sustainable development experience for the open source developers in the .NET open source community specifically. So how have we been thinking about the engineering investment areas? So customers, since .NET Core was launched, and .NET 5 and .NET 6, the incarnations in that series, we see that customers are increasingly asking for how to make the .NET on Linux ecosystem richer and richer. We see that as an opportunity because we see that place is still quite nascent and we can actually make an impact in that area. And that is something we've been focusing on, like how do we make customer experience better while developing and deploying .NET applications on Linux-based platforms. So we have been, and I'm going to talk about a few projects that we've been investing in, and we have been also focusing on not just the developer experience as it pertains to coding, but we are also looking at the ecosystem and the tools that the developers are using, solving problems such as identity and say Microsoft AD and things like that. The second area is obviously .NET developer tooling that we have been investing in. Some of it has been like investing in existing AWS tooling, where we have been focused a lot on how to include more .NET-centric features and that pertains to the new features that come out every year through the new versions of .NET. How do we accelerate that process on AWS? How do we bring that quickly on AWS, not only for our customers, but also for the community to use at large? And going to the community projects that we have been supporting, we started a funding initiative, and I'm going to talk about it in a lot more detail when we come to that slide. But at an overview level, we have been funding projects just monetarily, just to create a more sustainable developer experience, whoever is developing that project in the community. So .NET is, by definition, free, and there is no reward right off the bat. So, and we heard this from the community, and we thought that that would be a place for us to go and contribute to. Secondly, we have a few programs around, you can ask for AWS credits if you're building .NET open source projects. You can use AWS tools and services for free, up to a certain limit. We have it capped at $300 based on whatever you need. We're happy to give you more credits to use AWS services for .NET development. And finally, we've always been supporting user groups. And this is not a new initiative part of this. We have been supporting user groups across the world. We have presented in user groups and funded them as the need was presented to us. So moving on to some of the tools that we have, right? So I will dive into the 2022 projects in a bit, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about Porting Assistant for .NET. So this is not a 2022 project, but we have been working at it since 2019. So it started when customers started asking for how do we port and how do we move our .NET framework applications to Linux, right? So that was the Uber problem statement that we started with. So Porting Assistant has a GUI, which .NET developers love, thanks to the Visual Studio ecosystem. It has a GUI, it has a Visual Studio extension, and it also has a CLI. So it basically scans your code and figures out what packages you use. And based on that, it recommends and also ports to the newest available packages that are out there in NuGet. So we basically create a database of all the NuGet libraries, and we track the version changes that happens in NuGet, and we keep a track of that. We give you an assessment of your application. You basically upload a solution file or just run an assessment on Visual Studio, and it scans your entire code base and suggests that these are the areas and these are the potential incompatibilities that you're looking at. And then when you click port, it will port all the available new packages that are out there in NuGet and make your code compatible with the new version of .NET, whichever you choose as the target framework. So you can choose a source and target. So if you have a .NET framework 4.8, you can basically choose that as a source, and you can choose .NET 7, and it will give you the assessment and porting. So we currently have over 2,500 customers who are using this tool on a regular basis, and I think we have 25,000 downloads of this tool. So this tool is entirely open source, and this has been open source for a while. And we have been doing incremental development on Porting Assistant since we have started. So the main problem that we are facing now is the long tail of incompatibilities, because it's impossible for us to know that what incompatibility you would hit in what kind of project. So the call to action here is, if you're interested in contributing to projects, come to us, we will set you up. If you have a specific package that you think should be part of .NET 7 or .NET 6, if you're using the LTS versions, you can basically contribute to that package, and then we can add it to our code translation agent that basically powers Porting Assistant. So we're very excited about this product. First of all, it's an open source product. We welcome the community to make this better and better for all developers, all .NET developers as they move to .NET, the new incarnation of .NET. So in that vein, I'll talk about, I've ordered the 2022 projects in that way. So I'll talk about the first project that we tackled this year. And we started on this from last year. So we heard from customers that web forms, ASP.NET Web Forms is not supported on the .NET series or .NET Core and .NET 5 and so on. So, and there is no way for customers to actually port a web forms application to .NET Core compatible application. So we launched for a few features, for example, few controls that folks used back in the day in ASP.NET Web Forms. We introduced that capability in Porting Assistant and our code translation engine that you can port some of that to .NET Core. But obviously, this is far from complete, and this is also where we actually request the community to chip in, because if you care about Blazor as the future of ASP.NET, if you care about it, please come and talk to us. We'd be happy to set you up, and we can work together to basically move this ball forward. We are also looking at things such as web forms to say AngularJS or React.js and basically breaking out the back end and the front end of the web application. So web forms was a very coupled architecture, and right now web application has evolved with the JavaScript revolution and whatnot. And we are looking to see how we can make an impact in this area and help customers move web forms projects to Linux. And do it in a most cost-effective and quick, in a quick manner. The second project we have been investing in since last year, and we did a lot of things over the 2 years on this project, is Core WCF. So WCF applications or Windows Communication Framework, as you know, has been one of the major technologies that came after web services or ASMX, the SOAP-based web services. So, and customers, and a lot of enterprise customers actually, they have WCF applications today, and they want to move out of WCF. Some of the customers we hear want to completely modernize WCF applications to API-based or gRPC-based applications. But some say that, hey, we need this application for the next 5 years. We don't want to spend so much time and effort and also money to actually move WCF and completely modernize the stack. So what can you do for us so that in these next 5 years, we don't have to stick around on Windows-based platforms, and we can use Linux and leverage .NET Core and .NET 7 to do this modernization. So the Core WCF project was started by a developer in Microsoft in the WCF team. We got connected with that individual very early in the process of the Core WCF development, and we have been working together since. So we are kind of in lockstep with Microsoft on this project, where we want to improve the experience, the customer experience of Core WCF going forward. So the things we have done in this area is not only it is a port and it is available through Porting Assistant, but we have also tried to improve Core WCF, not keep it with the limitations that WCF had. So some of the areas that we have invested in are, we have included federated identity support in the HTTP bindings. And as you would know, WCF had HTTP, TCP, name pipes, and message queuing as the transport layer technologies. So what we have tried to do is we have tried to abstract out the message queuing to include the several other message brokers that are available today. So you have RabbitMQ, you name it, right? You have RabbitMQ, you have Amazon SQS, you have several other, a plethora of like messaging services that are available, Kafka, for example. So what we have done is we have actually contributed to a design that provides a layer for that messaging framework. So you can provide implementation of the messaging framework you want to use with WCF, and that not only like adds to that existing WCF functionality, but makes core WCF much more robust and much more versatile, because you can use the new messaging frameworks with your existing tooling, right? So the implementation that we are working on right now is, again, it's completely based on like the community asks on the project. So we look at the issues on GitHub, and we prioritize accordingly where we will invest in. So we have been building the RabbitMQ implementation, and it will probably be released end of this year. This usually gets bundled up with major releases that core WCF has, and based on that, it will be released. So the other thing we have introduced in core WCF, and we are also looking at, are that core WCF started when it was still .NET 5, right? So the target framework that core WCF is built on was started on .NET 5. Although it's supported .NET Standard 2.0, but the framework it was written in was .NET 5, right? So we did the .NET 6 support in adding .NET Standard 2.0 this year, and also have made the changes for .NET, like core WCF, to use .NET 6 as the programming framework. So if you're interested in .NET 6 and you're interested in core WCF, you could contribute to core WCF today, and you can, like, it's completely a community-driven project. So it's, although like AWS is like the second largest code contributor to this, that's just because we got in very early. We thought this was extremely important for some of our enterprise customers. And that's why the call to action is, if you're interested in contributing to this project or even discussing it for your applications, come talk to us. There's a whole pathway using Porting Assistant to use core WCF for your WCF applications. The other project that we have been working on this year is around AD connectivity from Linux containers. So when customers start modernizing, they have always told us that it's so hard to get away from AD, because AD connects all of their organization. So so modernization happens application to application, but the infrastructure that is set up has been set up for the entire organization. So it's extremely hard for customers to change the overall infrastructure for one application to be modernized. So gMSAs are very popular on Windows containers. So group managed service accounts, which you can use to manage Kerberos tickets, principals, and you can use that on multiple servers using gMSAs. We thought that's a great architecture that can be ported onto Linux, and there was no such technology to do that. We contributed to seamless domain join for Linux instances, and that's available through AWS Directory Service and managed AD that we offer. But there was no way to actually have a gMSA-like architecture from Linux containers, to set up Linux containers to connect to AD, the Linux container hosts to connect to AD. And because the containers are short-lived, it's transient, right? So whenever you make a connection, the connection would go off if the container goes off, and then you have to make another connection. So we worked on something called credentials fetcher. So basically, it fetches the Kerberos tickets from the host, and it's a daemon that sits on your instances, like the Linux instances. So if you know about ccg.exe, so that's a closed source black box that today does gMSA. So this is a very similar architecture as the ccg.exe that Microsoft provides. So Credentials Fetcher is available as RPM packages on Fedora and Amazon Linux 2022. Amazon Linux is still in RC 3.1, and we are introducing managed support in ECS through ECS Agent. So we are also looking into domainless gMSA, where you do not need to connect your host to AD, and you would operate in a domainless way to actually connect to AD. But before all that, why are we investing in AD? Some might say that AD is an old technology, right? But it's extremely hard for our customers to come out of it. It's extremely hard for our customers until that ideal North Star they reach, where everything is like OpenAuth, and then OpenAuth will become new AD, right? So that is why we are still investing in this, is because we want to help our customers to modernize .NET framework applications to Linux. So when customers are doing, have to connect to SQL Server over Windows authentication from .NET Core apps, there's no way that they can do it from Linux containers if they have AD connectivity. So this is the piece that solves that purpose. This will, in 2023, probably will look into proliferating this technology across other AWS services, such as Fargate, and also other Linux distros. Ubuntu is also on the radar. So again, the call to action is, if you're interested in this is a completely open source project, Credentials Fetcher. Come and build this area for the next 10 years. At least we see that AD is not going anywhere. Okay, so native ahead of time compilation. This technology was front and center of .NET 7 launch this year. But before even this technology, what customers told us was when they were launching Lambdas with .NET, right? There's a constant cold start problem that the customers were facing. The cold start performances were not good because that's how Lambda works. So Lambda has micro VMs or containers that are spun up in the background. They live only as long as the Lambda is invoked, then they go away, and then it needs to be again provisioned for that Lambda to actually get other invokes. So that causes the cold start. But how could we, and then the JIT compiler kicks in every time your infrastructure is provisioned for your Lambda to be invoked. And JIT compiler does our runtime compilation of intermediate language code to native code, and that also takes up a long time. So native ahead of time on native AOT is a new technology in .NET 7. It's still quite experimental because it doesn't support every use case. For example, it doesn't support ASP.NET yet. So it's only supported for console applications, and we wanted to give customers an early access to native AOT on AWS Lambda. And we have a whole talk, and I'm going to talk about this. So how can you use native AOT to build your Lambda applications today? So if you know about the Lambda tools, which is part of the .NET CLI extensions that we provide, you can use this technology through your .NET CLI if you have the Lambda tools NuGet package installed. You can also use it through Visual Studio Toolkit that we have, and there are Lambda blueprints which are native AOT enabled. Finally, you can use it through the SAM CLI. So that is another entry point to build and deploy Lambda, and all of these are open source contributions, right? So, and I'll talk about the final bullet in a while, but going back to the problem of cold starts. So we have seen through benchmarking that this is reducing cold start times by 20 to 70% depending on the size of your Lambda. So what native AOT does is basically front loads all the compilation ahead of time. You spend a little more time compiling your application, and then the binaries produced are completely, like the binary is native code. There is no more runtime compilation from IL to native code happening at all anymore. This is not a silver bullet for everything, because a lot of things don't work yet. Like its reflection is a problem. Project dependencies is a problem, because if you see what JIT did was JIT could at runtime connect different libraries into the binary and then produce a binary or native code that just worked, right? But you cannot do that with native AOT. So native AOT, your entire application, and that is why this is good for Lambdas, because Lambdas are single executables that you can run, right? So if you have multiple dependencies and DLLs that you're linking, probably native AOT is not the solution today, but it's also going to evolve, and we are kind of thinking about investing heavily in this technology because we feel that the performance benefits are like off the roof. So the other feature that we collaborated with Microsoft on .NET Runtime was to add localization through static linking. So we did static linking for our libicu libraries, and that is like reducing the platform dependencies as customers move to Linux and use native AOT. So like I said, native AOT is available on all the Lambda tooling, and we are going to produce trimming support in our SDKs. And if you're interested in native AOT or improving some of our tooling, just raise a PR. Just raise a PR. We are extremely responsive on our GitHub, and we continue to look at GitHub on a regular basis. So AWS Deploy Tool for .NET. So this is the tool that Mayur talked about, which we released this year. So this talks about, so the main problem statement was that when customers came to AWS, there are many compute services, and for good reasons. Every compute service has a different functionality that it's solved, a different use case that customers could use it for. But when you're using .NET applications, how do you have a uniform experience while deploying to these services? So if you have a .NET applications and you want to go to Amazon ECS, for example, or App Runner, do you have the same experience? And what does that same experience look like? Is that the same experience that we are introducing, or are we meeting where the customer's at? So at AWS, we constantly think about how can we meet where customers are at, and we build technology starting from that point, just to solve that if customers are used to using the .NET CLI, how can we make .NET CLI better with AWS tooling that customers can then use it? So with this AWS Deploy tool, you can use it on .NET CLI and through Visual Studio Toolkit. And customers, it's easy to use, and then it supports ASP.NET Core, Blazor WebAssembly, and long-running services today. And it supports the 3 services that are mentioned today. And we are improving on that. And there's a design out on GitHub around a messaging framework where we are seeking community feedback and developer feedback to actually go back and look at how can customers use the messaging the messaging services that we have, like Kinesis or SQS, managed Kafka. How do we use that from .NET applications, and how can we enhance this tooling for customers? Again, this is a fully open source project. You can go and find it under AWS org on GitHub. And again, if you're interested in one of those areas that you want to invest in, we would love your contribution. And we want to make this space robust and make this space driven by community so that we can take the ball forward. Finally, these were our engineering contributions for this year, and we are currently in planning phase for next year, and next year it'll be bigger and better. So some of the things that we are doing in the community, like we mentioned that earlier this year on Twitter, as well as through some of our professional connections with some of the maintainers of .NET projects, we found that .NET open source is heavily underfunded. The .NET open source that is outside and not controlled by any enterprise is heavily underfunded. And the sad thing about .NET open source is we still call it third-party open source. That should not be the case about .NET open source. We should not continue to call it third-party. It's open source. It's not third-party. So what AWS did here is that we just talked to a lot of maintainers and learned that they have all the development ecosystem set up. They have already set up the deployment processes, the tooling, and that is something that they did not need our help from. What they needed our help from was funding to have a sustained development. And after the initial excitement of launching our .NET projects, any open source project for that matter, what the maintainers are left with is grunt work of maintaining that project, right? And there is no reward in the game, and that's what we just wanted to contribute. So this year we pledged $5,000 each for 10 community projects, and we've already contributed to 9 of them, and we're talking to another, we cannot give out the name because they've not agreed yet, and these are based on how impactful the project has been in the .NET community, right? So if you see these projects, each of them have more than 1 million downloads on NuGet. They're used by several of enterprises, and somehow and sadly enough, they have been underfunded, and our contribution has generated some good comments in the community. This is a second program, and this is open for every .NET developer out there. So you can ask for $300 worth of credits to use AWS services and tooling to build .NET open source projects. The only ask is that you have a GitHub with a project with at least 200 lines of code. And we do check that. Like, we like to see if you're a serious .NET open source developer, we are willing to fund you to use AWS. Finally, user group support. We support user groups. We have been supporting user groups for a long time. If you need a technical presenter, we have a whole team of developers and developer advocates, and myself, SDM, and Mayur included, we can come present at the user group. And if you need offsetting some of the costs to running a user group, we can help with that as well. And if you need some swag, we always love swag. So if you're interested in knowing more about .NET on AWS, you can connect to us on Twitter. Our handle is .NET on AWS. And you can connect to us on Slack developer channel, and you can pose any question, any complaints, any feedback. We're always looking for more and more feedback from .NET developers such as yourself. I wish I can meet with all of you in person. That will just help me with my roadmap. And you can come to the website, .NET on AWS, for every information out there on AWS around .NET. So you have getting started docs, you have sample code that you can check, you have documentation links, and you will always get a latest update on what's going on. And like reInvent talks are like a culmination of a year-long effort, but the website is kind of a running doc or it's a breathing website that you can come to.
I think we need to cut over for the next sessions, but we'll be here if you have any more questions. But really appreciate you all coming out. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.